It's a great honor to welcome Freddie DeBoer to this podcast. He is an independent writer whose work can be found on his Substack page, and he is also the author of a book titled The Cult of Smart, published in 2020. And he has developed a reputation for people like myself as the Marxist that non-Marxists read and enjoy and appreciate. So welcome, Freddie, onto the show.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right, awesome. So I should like to begin by asking you about the thesis of your book, The Cult of Smart.
Sure. So I will say that the book came out 2 years ago, and I started writing it 5 years ago, and I still don't have a good, simple elevator pitch for it. I've always had a super hard time sort of just decomposing it down very simply, but I will put it this way. In the last decades of the 20th century, the American economy changed in a very monumentous way, which is that previously you had something called the Fordist Compromise, or the Fordist economy, which was named after Henry Ford and the company Ford, which was you had companies like these auto manufacturers, which were large employers that employed a lot of people. And these people generally did not need to have a college education. Almost all of these jobs you could get only with a high school degree or even without a high school degree. And those jobs enabled a lot of people to live middle-class existences. So a lot of people would go to work at the factory at the edge of town, and they would be part of a union, and they would make enough money where they could own their own home, own a car or two, and raise a family. That way of life started to disappear in the last decades of the 20th century. Uncontroversially, this is because of automation. So we got better and better at making machines that could do the jobs that humans used to do. And generally speaking, if you can scale that up, it's cheaper to build the machines than to employ people. And so a lot of jobs were lost to that. More controversially, there's the role of globalization or offshoring. So a lot of American jobs went to Mexico, to China, to Bangladesh, etc. And so what happened was that there used to be reliable ways in which people who were not educated were able to get in the middle United States. Because that went away, you started to see a push to send more and more students to college, because college has always enjoyed and still enjoys. People with college degrees enjoy a wage premium. In other words, people who go to college still and have for the entirety of the 20th century made more money than people who do not go to college. And so this was seen as a way to employ the masses, is to send everybody to college, send everybody to school. There's a few problems with that notion, though. And I think that all of the problems that we have with our higher education system ultimately come down to tensions with that project. The first problem is that the college wage premium, we know empirically, is a function of the scarcity of a college degree. In other words, still to this day, less than 40% of American adults has a college degree. Okay, and when you go out into a labor market, you are selling yourself. You are trying to sell the parts of yourself that are not fungible, right? The parts of yourself that are rare, that I have a rare skill that I can sell. The more that you have a skill that's in demand that is rare, the more money you make, right? If we send everyone to college, right, then the degree ceases to be valuable monetarily, because everyone will have the advantage. It's a relative advantage. And if you give a relative advantage to everyone, it ceases to be an advantage. The other problem is that not everyone is made to go to college or meant to go to college. There's plenty of people who have plenty of things that they can offer as human beings, but who are not temperamentally interested in going to college, or who don't have the necessary academic background to be able to flourish in college. And I think that this is a permanent situation. I don't think that it's possible through policy to make everyone into a college-ready person. You can look at the education policy of the last quarter century as being an attempt to shove more and more and more people into the pipeline. And ultimately, what that will do is you either have a lot of people failing out, which is what we have now. So depending on whose numbers you look at something like half the people who start college never finish, right? Or you can just water down the degree to the point that anybody can get the degree, but then again, once again, you are removing the very value that a degree once had. And finally, to stack on top of that, there's the ideology that attends to all of this, which is that smart is an existential human quality, in the sense that to be smart or not smart says everything about you, right? It is not that great of an insult if I say you suck at basketball, right? It's not that great of an insult if I say you're not much of a musician. It's not that much of a insult if I say you aren't handy in the kitchen, you don't know how to cook. If I say you're not smart, right, I am perceived to be saying something that is totally dismissive of your value, that is an utter attack on your whole being. And so the cult of smart, among other things, is that assumption that only academic success matters, and how that's baked into our policy world, our policy apparatus.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm seeing a lot of books which are widely acclaimed that speaks of the same subjects as you do. I'm thinking of Charles Murray's is Coming Apart, and Catherine Page Harden's is The Genetic Lottery. And I wonder, this, again, you're coming from a, again, left-wing perspective, I presume. Mm-hmm. And these are not the typical concerns that you would find in a, what you call a garden variety, or particularly young Marxists these days. And of course, I'm from Vietnam. So again, the word Marxist carries a rather harrowing connotation. Mm-hmm. But in current political discourse, Marxism has now been equated almost entirely with communism. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, and this is something that my right-wing leaning friends may disagree, is that we should read Marx carefully, divorced from the context of the system in which Lenin, in Marx's name, established. So I guess I pass on the question to you. Can we understand Marx and, I guess, examine Marxism divorced from the context of communism?
It's a good question. So it's funny that you asked that. I am someone who was willing to call himself a Marxist still. I often tell young leftists that they don't have to be Marxists, that Marxism is kind of an intellectual dead letter at this point. I don't describe myself as a communist, where I might have in my 20s, etc., because in order to be a communist, there has to be a communist movement, and there isn't one, right? Like, I mean, even the die-hard holdout. So I don't call myself a communist because there's no communist movement for me to be a part of. I do think that Marxism offers us a lot of things that are valuable and things that we can learn from. But it's important to say that everything is being filtered through a veil of ignorance that is unfortunately held even by many people who self-identify as communists or Marxists, etc. So a few of the misconceptions about Marxism that I clear up all the time. So Jordan Peterson, for example, when he attacks Marxism, he does so by arguing that the idea of perfect equality is unachievable, and that it's destructive to try to pursue that. But that has never been a political goal of Marxism. So for the record, when people hear Marxism, they often think equality, but the reality is that equality has never been a goal of the Marxist project. Marxism is about an end to exploitation, right? So if I were to give like the shortest, briefest introduction to Marxism I could possibly could, I would say Marx looks at the world. He's in the industrial age. He's in the beginning of the industrial age in England, which saw the transformation of the English countryside in a matter of a couple of decades. Just a totally incredible increase in the amount of productive apparatus in the matter of a few decades. I mean, England became unrecognizable compared to what it had been, and it's all in service to these factories where you have which are owned by people who are making an immense amount of wealth, and they're being worked by people who are working under deplorable conditions for very low wage. And Marx says, okay, capitalism is at its heart a series of exchanges of value, right? I want some apples, you've got apples, I've got money, I give you money, you give me apples, right? Those exchanges are what capitalism is on the day-to-day basis. There's always going to be disagreement about exactly what something might be worth, but markets are meant to sort of establish this notion of equivalent exchange. In other words, I have to feel like the what I'm paying for is a good price for apples, and so does the seller. We both have to arrive at some sort of consensus about whether or not the price is appropriate, or else the exchange doesn't happen. But the exchange happens every day because people have come to consensus on what the price of something is. If the problem is that if you think that capitalism is about equal exchange, where does profit come from? Where is value created, right? In other words, money is created in the process of capitalism. It did not exist, and then it does exist. Value is made. And Marx says, where could that value come from? And if you look at the production of a commodity, you know, a widget, whatever you want, those apples, for example, you have the workers who work. You have the productive apparatus, like the machinery, right? So the agricultural or industrial machinery, and you have the raw materials, right? The steel or the apple seeds or whatever. And you take those things and you put them together. And in order for capitalism to work, right, the price of those things must be less than what you then sell the commodity for, right? In other words, if I'm spending more making apples than I can charge you for the apples, then my business won't last very long, right? Because I'm operating at a loss. So value has to come from somewhere. And Marx says that it comes from the worker, because the worker is the sort of the part of the chain of production that has agency, right? That has the ability to create, to do something. If you leave the productive apparatus alone, if you leave the machines alone, then they don't do anything. If you leave the raw materials alone, then nothing happens. No value is created. It's the worker who has to be there creating the value. Now, very important to say that the labor theory of value, which is what I'm talking about, was not invented by Marx. It was espoused by a lot of people, including Adam Smith, who many people think of as like the free market capitalist economist. Adam Smith was at times a proponent of a labor theory of value. And so what Marx says is that, Marx points out, is that, like, look, if you look at this total system, the people at the top who are not working but just own, the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, the class that owns stuff, makes the majority of the value that's created through that exchange, even though it's the workers who are the ultimate source of value, right? And so that is exploitation. And he says that the rate of profit can really actually be called the rate of exploitation, because it always describes a scenario in which the workers receive less than they produce. Marxism at its heart is an attempt to identify that sort of discordant reality between the workers and how much they produce and how much they earn. And communism is an attempt to change that dynamic, right? Mm-hmm. You'll notice that nowhere in there is the concept of equality ever advanced, right? And in fact, Marx said things that imply that the equality is not in the cards. So a famous Marxist statement is, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, right? Yeah. Well, from each according to their ability implies in and of itself that different people have different levels of ability and different things that they are good at, right? It is so my thesis that not everybody is good at school and that not everybody belongs in college is perfectly consonant with the Marxist project. If you understand the project does not have to do with equality. Now, it happens to be the case that a byproduct of putting socialist principles into practice, putting Marxist principles into practice, will increase equality, and that's probably socially a good thing to a degree. But it's essential to say that's not like the political goal of Marxism, and that misconception has flavored the debate about Marxism for generations, even though it is a misconception. And it's also important to say that after a communist revolution, if there was a successful one that actually accomplished everything a communist revolution is supposed to do, which has never happened because a communist revolution is a worldwide revolution by definition, which we could talk about if you want. After that fact, there's still going to be some summative inequality, right? See, both Marx and Engels, independently of each other, arrived at the conclusion that there's always going to be differences between people, and differences can always be represented as an inequality. So that's sort of my brief for why my book does not sort of violate Marxism, because so much of the belief that it does is dependent on this idea that the political goal of Marxism is equality, but that is not and has never been true.
Mm-hmm. Right. So an issue that I've had with Marx is that, and later on to a certain extent Marxism, is that, I do not believe that Marx is a liberal, at least in a classical sense. And, what he advocates for is the all too famous phrase, dictatorship of the proletariat. And this is something that later Marxists, either orthodox or revisionists, adhere to, and that is, a liberal society can tolerate some amount of Marxist people and beliefs in their ranks. They're called fifth columnists, derisively. But when you are a Marxist, you are not happy, in my view, until at least your nation state or the world becomes Marxist. So in that sense, it is not a philosophy, but a religion. Marx himself calls his theory science. So I would like to present a quote from Isaiah Berlin, the British philosopher and great classical liberal. He described Marx as among the great authoritarian founders of new faiths, ruthless subverters and innovators who interpret the world in terms of a single, clear, passionately held principle, denouncing and destroying all that conflicts with it. His faith was that of boundless, absolute kind, which puts an end to all questions and dissolves all difficulties. So I guess with that quote in mind, I bring my question to you is Marxism compatible with liberalism?
Right. So if Isaiah Berlin is correct, then I'm not much of a Marxist. Okay, because I certainly don't believe in a totalizing system that fixes everything. I want to sort of rattle off a few responses here. The first thing just to say is that it's essential that people understand the dictatorship of the proletariat is a transitional period as described by Marx and Engels, because the dictatorship of the proletariat is not a perpetual scenario. It is in the sort of the Marxist sort of literature, a necessary evil that is a part of the process of moving from a capitalist to a socialist world. Okay. Dictatorship of the proletariat is never meant to rule forever. Now, part of the difficulty here, and this is another thing I say to people all the time, the actual communist state, I think to a degree that people don't understand, or stateless society, etc., the actual communist future is purposefully underwritten in Marxism. In other words, people go looking for an exact answer to what the Marxist state exactly looks like all the time, and they don't find it because Marx didn't really write it down. Now, there are some of the things that he says. I wish I could cite chapter and verse right now. I can't give you a recitation right now, but there are some of the things that he says where he indicates that he understands that the future is not being prescribed to a degree that's necessary, because he says, I'm not a seer. I can't look into the future and describe what the actual post-capitalist society is going to look like necessarily. I need to be flexible and to keep my particular claims for how society is going to be organized a little bit loose. So if anyone tells you that they know exactly what the Marxist future looks like, they might have a great vision for it, but they're not pulling it directly from the source. Okay, to a considerable extent. I mean, if you look at some of the major cleavages in Bolshevism, for example, so the difference between Stalin's socialism in one state, right, or communism in one state, and state capitalism, as opposed to Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, etc. Those are issues that emerge from trying to actually put this stuff into practice, right? And Marx's vision is, if you listen to him, intentionally sort of left vague. Now, you could also make the criticism of Marx and Engels and say, you described this really compelling critique of contemporary society, and you set up a few dominoes, and you included some sort of discussion of what would happen, but you didn't actually say exactly how the society would function. For myself, I mean, I think it can be a strength of Marxism that it does not perfectly prescribe this is what's going to happen after the revolution. I think I am not by far the world's most best read Marxist. There's plenty of people who are much deeper studiers than I am. From what I have gleaned myself, I think that the closest thing to what is implied by Marx and Engels is a series of autonomous or semi-autonomous collectives where everyone has right of exit. So you can go to a collective and it's ruled by direct democracy, by workers' councils. This is what the Soviets are. So in the Soviet socialist republics, the word Soviet literally means a workers' council. And different semi-autonomous collectives might have different rules. But I think that if you want to say like this is just a failing of Marxism, that the reason why it so often has led to dictatorship and to scenarios that are not at all Marxist. So, for example, China is a country with homeless people and billionaires, which does not sound like much of a communist state to me, right? I think you can make that criticism, and there's much to criticize in Marxism. I will note that both Marx and especially Engels were in their own day-to-day lives ardent civil libertarians who were vociferous defenders of the free press and of free speech. And many of their followers have been, such as Rosa Luxemburg, who was a communist and an ardent defender of personal liberty. So I don't think, to answer your question, to sum up a very long answer, I don't think that Marxism is necessarily opposed to a sort of a version of classical liberalism that defends rights like the right to free speech, the right to a free press, etc. I think that the founders of Marxism practiced a form of classical liberalism in their defense of free expression of ideas. The point about the dictatorship of the proletariat is a fair one, but again, that is happening in the hazy distance of the future that Marx keeps at arm's length. And again, it is a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is, of course, the vast majority of human beings. And so, to the degree that it would entail a repression of speech, it would entail the repression of speech of a very small ownership class, and specifically the things that they were attempting to do to undermine the revolution. And again, it's not intended to be permanent. But that's not a perfect answer, but that's the best I got.
That's it. Okay. So my next question is, I'm sure that you frequent or hang around, I guess, Marxist or Marx-leaning circles, and one of the worst things that you can be called being a Marx adherent is a revisionist. And
Mhm.
you've mentioned Jordan Peterson before, and if I were to devise a Jordan Peterson bingo game, one of the squares would likely be whenever he mentions the term postmodern and neo-Marxist in a bad light.
Mhm.
Um, and I think what he meant by neo-Marxist is the revisionist Marxist. And the way I see it, they are currently winning, or at least their ideas have become the dominant form of leftism. And I guess I will refer to a title of a book by Leszek Kolakowski, right? I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's titled The Main Currents of Marxism.
Mhm.
So can you explain to us what orthodox and revisionist Marxism means?
Okay, so this is a good example of where, I wish that I was a better student of Marxism. So to give you a sort of sense of what happened with me, when I was young, as in college aged, I was in Marxist reading groups, and I was in uh, I was doing sort of learning the catechism of Marxism, and I was, attempting to read Capital Volume 2, and learning my Gramsci from my Althusser, and trying to sort of wade through those waters. Eventually, it became a race that I wasn't willing to run, because there was just always people who knew more than me. And it was clear that the Marxism, so you have the sort of bedrock beginnings of Marxism in Marx himself and in Engels. As many people have argued, Engels is an equal partner with Marx when it comes to the formation of the basics of the theory. Marx dies never having seen a Marxist revolution. In 1917, you have the 1st of February revolution in Russia, and then the October Revolution. And there's a civil war. The Bolsheviks defeat the Mensheviks. And now you have Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin have won out against like the SRs. So the SRs they would be considered radicals compared to like the average American, but they were sort of like conservative socialists, so to speak, compared to the Bolsheviks. You have the influence of anarchist thinkers like Bakunin and Kropotkin. Anyway, you have a state now that has been taken over by people who want to do a stateless society. The problem with that is that Marxism is a post-statist philosophy. In other words, part of the Marxist revolution is the demise of states. So the state is seen as a illegitimate structure. It's an invention of capital that is used to divide workers from workers in order to maintain a certain economic situation. You also have this issue where a socialist economy is trying to be built within one very large country, a resource-rich country, but it has to interact with other countries that are still operating based on currency exchange. And you have a population of people who need some way to be able to interact with each other economically in order to be able to go about their day. So you have the rise of what's called state capitalism, which is Russia has a command economy, and it attempts to determine by fiat the division of different resources to different places and to different people. These central commands. So this sort of Marxist theory of being able to organize the economy not through markets but rather through some sort of centralized decision-making apparatus, which doesn't go very well. You have socialism in one country because one of the things that many socialists and Marxists thought would happen is that if you had a major country becoming a Marxist, and that would spark a domino effect of cascading revolutions across the globe of other countries that would throw off the yoke of capitalism and would join up and become one world government or one world order. That doesn't happen. The country finds that it still needs to be distributing currency to its people in order to exchange for goods, because it doesn't really have a system for sort of division of resources otherwise to do that. So this is sort of like the first, but far from the only sort of Marxism coming to terms with the limitations of not being able to sort of fulfill all of the conditions that Marx and Engels had. And I think that one of the most, cogent and trenchant criticisms of Marxism is that it was just very unlikely that there was ever going to be the conditions on the ground necessary for a Marxist revolution to happen. In other words, like the fact that Russia was doomed to failure, the USSR was doomed to failure by the very tenets of Marxism, is like saying, well, okay, then what are the ideal conditions and how can you possibly meet them? Anyway, so you then have this big split between people who recognize that socialism in the USSR does not look much like Orthodox Marxism says it must, and the people who defend the USSR, who say like socialism in actual practice, or actually existing socialism. They say that we have to defend this system. And this is the sort of the basis of the Cold War, among other things. Famously, Trotsky loses the power struggle with Stalin. He's forced to flee to Mexico and South America. Because he loses the power struggle, even though Trotsky was the one who led the Red Army in the Civil War. And Trotsky becomes this critic of what is happening in the Soviet Union. And so for a Trotskyite, the USSR, Marxist-Leninism, which is another fancy way to say Stalinism, is itself a revision of Marxism. It is revisionist. It is not actually Marxism in practice, because you can't have socialism in one country and you can't have state capitalism and be considered a Marxist country. I am not what you call a Trotskyist, but I fall in this camp, right? I mean, I am very much a old school Marx and Engels kind of a Marxist, in part because the USSR becomes a brutal dictatorship. It harshly represses internal dissent. It commits genocide against some people. It is a horrific place in many, many ways. The gulags are filled. One of the goals of the Bolshevik Revolution was to eliminate the anti-Semitism that had been common to the Tsarist regimes, but the USSR practices a version of anti-Semitism in some ways. So to me, right, like, Marxist-Leninism is revisionism itself, right? But if you ask a dedicated ML, right, the actual revisionists are often referred to as sort of postmodern Marxists. So if you look at the history of French post-structuralists, you have guys like Althusser, who is a dedicated and self-proclaimed communist. You also have critics of communism, right, within that band. But often if someone says revisionism, they're sometimes talking about sort of French post-structuralists who borrow from Marxism, but who have a series of critiques of it, or they alter it for its own use. To me, right, like, saying postmodern neo-Marxists makes no sense, right? So if postmodernism means anything, if post-structuralism means anything, it means resistance to grand overarching narratives, right? Like the French thing is the idea that the French postmodern tradition is based on the idea that humans keep creating these big overarching, what's sometimes called meta narratives about how the world works, and about truth, justice in the American way, and about the clash of civilizations, et cetera, and that all of these are fake. All of these are made up. They're all invented by humans. In some of its more extreme forms, this is like saying, like, science, for example, is a meta narrative, and it's no more true than anything else, and it's just got the truth that we invested in. Blah, 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 blah. to me, all of that is superficially antagonistic to the basics of the Marxist project, right? I mean, you said it yourself already. Marx saw Marxism as the science of history, right? Like the attempt, and most people will say that it's a bad failure, but the attempt of Marxism was to be a version of science that uses history in the same way that biology and physics, etc., so that we can arrive at a scientific picture of the history of people, and seeing class struggle as the scientific sort of basis of the whole of history. So if someone like Jordan Peterson says, "Oh, those postmodern Marxists," it just doesn't make any sense, right? Like, if postmodernism is a rejection of grand narratives, right? What narrative is grander than the Marxist narrative, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the Marxist narrative is a story about the ability of people to completely transcend their current economic structure through a shared idea, right? And to build a better world. Marx would have seen nothing to agree with someone like Jacques Derrida, right? Because Marx believed, it's called dialectical materialism, is a term that's often used to refer to Marxism. It's dialectical in the sense that, like, it comes from like Hegel's dialectic. So Hegel had the idea of a thesis, an antithesis, and then the synthesis between the two. So ideas in combat together eventually form a synthesis of the two of them that includes the best of both and leads, towards truth. And that is central to Marx's idea, but also materialism, the idea that there is a here, right? There is a functional, objective reality in which we live, and that it is can be described by human beings, right? Like, for example, Trotsky said, "I am a Marxist and thus necessarily an atheist," right? In other words, the Marxist project assumed a objective answer to, like, the biggest of human questions: does God exist? So I can't tell you a ton about revisionism to the degree that some other people could, but what I can say for sure is that Jordan Peterson is just not being very coherent when he lumps in postmodernists and Marxists.
Yes. I think a careful reader of political philosophy would find that postmodernism and neo-Marxism are completely distinct schools of thought, and that I appreciate much of Dr. Peterson's thinking, but he does think or speak out of his depth in multiple occasions, and the postmodern neo-Marxist is one of them. One thing I very much appreciate about Marx, as well as the Marxist thinkers, at least of the orthodox kind, is that they have a broad and deep appreciation of history. It's no coincidence that some of the greatest historians in the 20th century are Marxists. I'm thinking Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson and Perry Anderson. So Marx's view of history, from my reading, is influenced a lot by Hegel, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, fellow German philosopher. So I'm asking you, to what extent does Marx's views of history aligns with Hegel, and to what extent does he deviates from Hegel?
Okay, well, if I apologized before for not being as strong of a reader of Marx as I should be, I'm really going to apologize about Hegel. Listen, I tried. He is not easy to read.
Oh, no,
okay?
No, he isn't.
Particularly in college, I did my best. Hegel. So the reason you say dialectical materialism, right, to contrast Marx with Hegel, is that Marx is a materialist, right? He believes in the objective reality of here and now. Hegel was, emerged from the school of German idealism. So he's coming from the tradition of Kant and the idea that there is an objective reality of ideas that in a way that trust me, I don't understand, but that there is an extra human or sort of not even extra human. What's the best way to put it? That ideas about forms can have real meaning in exactly the same way as the sort of corporeal reality of, here's my desk and I can touch it, sort of thing. But I would think to answer your specific question of, how do Hegel and Marx align? Again, speaking as not a very deep reader of Hegel, unfortunately, and not for lack of trying. Yeah, I think, again, like there's this concept that you have these really big ideas and they go into conflict with each other. Capitalism versus communism, for example, right? You have these big ideas and they and over the course of history, they do battle with each other. And, Hegel says, if you look at the history of ideas, what happens is not necessarily that one idea, wins and dominates over the other and the other is discarded, but rather that over time, because they are in combat with each other, right? Because they come into conflict with one another, ideas are sort of forced to take on the strong parts of the other idea. And what emerges from the conflict of ideas is a synthesis between the two, right? So again, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? One of the things that I say to people a lot is many people who hate Marxism are Marxian, meaning that they have borrowed the Marxist idea of history as a series of competing ideas about the economy, right? In other words, if you look out at the world and say, okay, let's say it's not 2022, let's say it's 1968. Okay, and it's somewhere like the peak of the power and influence of the Soviet Union, right? It's somewhere near the peak of their might, right? And you have China is an avowedly communist country. You have Vietnam split in two and engaged in a civil war. You have Korea has been split in two, and the north half is avowedly communist, and Cuba is an avowedly communist state. And there's things going on in Cambodia and Burma / Myanmar, and there are communist movements, serious communist movements in South America and in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And so it looks like this is like a real battle of wills between these two ideas, right? Like it's not clear that capitalism is going to win yet. If you look and you say, okay, we've got this great battle of ideologies between capitalism and communism, and one will emerge victorious. That in and of itself is kind of a Marxist idea, right? Like that sort of entails a Marxist vision of how history proceeds, right? And so like just saying like my ideology is not communism, it's capitalism, and capitalism will win the fight against communism, to me is like as a Marxian flavor. I think one of the things I say a lot is like Marx is a lot like Freud, which is that even the people who explicitly reject them, right, often think in frameworks that reflect the influence of their influence on thought overall.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I've always regarded, the success of a philosopher is not whether, a lot of people agree with them or everyone agrees with them, but they've managed to shape and change discourse in ways that weren't happening before. For example, people may not agree with Machiavelli, but to one extent or another, people understand what Machiavellism means, and to some extent, we all kind of practice it. But you raise a good point in how people who dislike Marxism are speaking in Marxian terms, and that brings me to the topic of class conflict. So Marxism or communism is described as an internationalist movement, which people who are fans of the nation state would find it disagreeable. But nevertheless, we see an international rise of worker-led parties or worker-led movements that has a national flavor to it. I mean, and Trump's win in America is due largely in part due to his appeal to the working class, Orban's victory in Hungary, Giorgia Meloni's victory over in Italy, and of course the Brexit movement. All of these carry some appeals to the working people who are, allegedly left behind by the elites and the globalists and all that. Secondly, if you examine Tucker Carlson, who's a notorious figure of the right, his economic policy, and Elizabeth Warren's, the left-wing professor at Harvard, his economic policy, you won't find too many differences. So my question now to you is, to what extent does the language of class conflict play into modern day contemporary political discourse?
Sure. So what you have described has been noted and is quite uncomfortable. I mean, the reality of the matter is that right-wing populists have much more purchase in the right-wing media than left-wing populists have in the left-wing media, in my opinion. And it's also the case that there's been an attempt to, and in a very effective way, I think, to marry nationalism with economic populism. Now, that's always been true. I mean, obviously, we can go back to the fascists, I mean, like the literal Italian fascists,
Mussolini.
And Mussolini and the Nazis. I'm trying to remember who said it, but someone once said that every fascism is the record of a failed revolution. In other words, like that these things emerge out of the inability of people to get socialist revolutions going. The first thing I would say is I would caution against seeing this symmetry between revanchist nationalism and sort of economic populism as necessarily a thing that has to exist. I mean, we can look at American history. If you go back to the 1910s, the 1920s, the heyday of the American labor movement and of the American socialist movement, so this was a time when Eugene Debs, the great socialist leader, got 1 million votes for president while he was in jail, right, for speaking out against the First World War. There was not the same sort of reflective assumption that someone who's speaking in the language of economic populism is necessarily also speaking the language of exclusion, anti-immigration, nationalism, etc. And I think that what we have is we've had a very effective conservative movement in this country. That Barry Goldwater devised a playbook, and Ronald Reagan perfected it, and the Republicans have been effectively running it with a little bit of Trumpism mixed in now, which is a whole other ball of wax. The idea that there's a lot of pointy-headed elites out there who want to look down their nose at you and let the immigration hordes in and change the nature of the country and de-Christianize a Christian nation and et cetera, is unfortunately a powerful meme for a lot of people. The only thing that we can do is to make better memes of our own, to remind people that working people of other countries are not our enemies. I think it's always really important. I mean, religion plays a major role in the process that you're describing, right? A big part of the way that the right-wing populist message came and corrupted populism writ large in the United States was it came on the wings of, again, Barry Goldwater talking about God and country. I think people don't understand this. When there's this assumption that America is so Christian because it's always been so Christian. But when the country was founded in 1776, only about 10% of Americans belonged to a church. Okay. There was a religious revival movement in this country, primarily in the 1950s, that dramatically increased religiosity and Christian values. It's not a coincidence that that period, the 1950s, was also when the conflict with the Soviet Union heated up to the great degree that it did. And of course, the Soviet Union was an atheist, officially atheist country, a godless country, etc. But yeah, it sucks. Like the economic populist but nationalist Tucker Carlson line, if it's voiced by the right person, can be an extremely popular and powerful one. Ronald Reagan won 49 states in 1984. I do think that there's hope for a multiracial working class coalition still along economic populist lines. It's important to say what has happened in American politics is that we are now aligning along college education, right? More than we are aligning around income levels. So in other words, whether or not you went to college is more of a indicator of your vote share, like who you're going to vote, than is your economic class now. It's even more powerful of a predictor than race, which would be hard to imagine 20 years ago. Going to college or not is associated with economic elitism also, but it's not the same thing, right? I think that there's still, if you had a really gifted politician, I think someone like a Bernie Sanders kind of figure could get credibility with the working class and could rally people along left-wing populist lines. The problem is the Democratic Party, as it's currently structured, would not allow for Bernie to win the nomination, right? In other words, or a Bernie, like an economic populist. So the Democratic Party is still too beholden to basic neoliberal beliefs. So I'm not super optimistic for the short term.
I see. I should like to add to your point of religious right-wing populism, in that, I'm reading about this guy, Father Charles Coughlin, who was alive during the time of FDR, and again, many of his policies are eerily close to socialism, but his anti-Semitism and his World War II isolationism really cemented him as a right-wing figure. And what is so staggering is that in a country of 125 million at that time, 40 listened to him. So almost 1 in 3. So right-wing populism, at least in your country, can be a seductive drug. But since I'm aware of our time, I should like to end with a quote from Karl Marx himself. This is from the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which is not to be confused with the Communist Manifesto. The quote says, "All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profane, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind." I'm sure it sounds better in German. So with that quote in mind, answer me this: why does Marx matter?
I think that you have to think about the kind of dude who would write what you just read, right? Which is kind of poetical, right? This is somebody who who doesn't write like a political functionary. This is a guy who was unemployed for most of his life. To the degree that he did anything, he was a writer. He hardly made any money off of it. He would go for long walks in London and wander around and look at the disgusting conditions in these factories and children losing limbs in the industrial machinery. He was only able to survive because his wealthy friend Friedrich kept lending him money. I think Marx matters because Marxism remains a sort of ghost in the machine that's rattling around in the capitalist consciousness. I think most people, even people who are ideologically opposed to Marxism, have a feeling in the back of their head that there's something not quite right about the division of wealth and income in our society, and have an understanding that the game really is rigged against ordinary people. And I think that even if Marx did not give us a description of how to move forward into paradise, and even if, as I believe is the case, the various attempts to implement Marxism in practice mostly ended in disaster. Although I think it does matter from country to country. I think there are differences in terms of, for example, I'd much rather live in Cuba than to live under the Khmer Rouge, for example. As much as those things failed, Marx asks questions about the capitalist project that the capitalist project has no answers for. And I'm someone who's a big believer in the fact that human economic systems continue to change no matter what we want, right? If you go back to the feudalist age, you can find a lot of people who believe that feudalism that was literally ordained by God, right? That it could never end. But then it ended because things always change. And things will change again from capitalism to something else. I'm just not willing to say what's going to come next will be socialism, let alone Marxism. But something is going to happen next. And so Marx is going to be that guy in the back of our minds, sort of kicking rocks around and asking questions.
I see. On that note, thank you very much, Freddie DeBoer, great scholar, not a good friend to capitalism, but a great friend of human freedom. Thank you again for coming to the show, and thank you for enlightening us on the thoughts of Marx. I've always thought that even if you are not a Marxist or will never be, I think something you should do is to read the works of Karl Marx with some care and consideration. So I appreciate your assistance with that, and I hope you continue success with your future work, and take care of yourself.
Thanks so much for having me on.